Imagine starting a new job with no contract, no paycheck, and no right to quit. Today, that sounds both absurd and illegal. We believe every person should have control over their own life. But in the ancient world, the line between prisoner, debtor, servant, and slave could be dangerously unclear. At some point, humans stopped merely defeating enemies or taking their land. They began treating other human beings as property people who could be traded, inherited, or forced to work. So, when did that begin? To find the answer, we have to travel back tens of thousands of years when our ancestors lived in small groups of hunters and gatherers. Food, tools, and territory were usually shared. There were no palaces, no bank accounts, and certainly no one walking around with an army of personal servants. Many scholars describe this way of life as a kind of primitive communism, a society in which people were relatively equal. But that equality did not necessarily come from kindness alone. The problem was practical. Keeping slaves made very little sense when everyone was constantly on the move. These groups had no permanent homes, no large food stores, and nowhere to confine prisoners. Most days, they gathered only enough food to survive. Adding another person who produced no extra food could leave the entire group hungry. And there was another fairly obvious problem. A captive could simply run away. Imagine trying to guard someone in a forest stretching for hundreds of miles while you also had to hunt animals, gather plants, and search for water. Turn your back for a few minutes, and that person could disappear into the trees. It was a terrible system of workforce management, although, to be fair, human resources departments had not been invented yet. But wait, some hunting communities broke this pattern surprisingly early. Along the Pacific Northwest coast, salmon were so abundant that people could catch them, dry them, and store enough food to survive the winter. They did not practice agriculture, yet they still accumulated wealth and surplus supplies. And once there was enough food to go around, keeping other people as forced labor became possible. From that point on, enslaved people were not only workers. They also became symbols of status and power. A leader who controlled many slaves could appear wealthier, stronger, and more respected. Captives were forced to cut fish, carry water, paddle canoes, and perform other exhausting tasks. This reveals an important pattern. Slavery often emerged when a society finally had enough surplus wealth to support it. The greatest turning point, however, came with the Neolithic Revolution. Humans stopped wandering, built permanent homes, planted crops, and settled in villages. But fields do not take care of themselves. Land had to be cleared, seeds planted, crops watered, and harvests gathered. As farms grew larger, the demand for labor rose sharply. And now captives were harder to escape, because settled villages had clear boundaries and organized communities. So why did wealthy landowners not simply hire workers? That sounds reasonable until you remember that land was still widely available. A free person could clear a plot and farm independently instead of spending every day working for someone else. This created a serious problem for anyone who wanted to control a large estate. Very few people would willingly serve them. The brutal solution was force. Here is the cold calculation behind the entire system. A captive was only worth keeping if that person produced more food than they consumed. As farming tools improved, one worker could grow enough crops to feed several people. That surplus turned human labor into something economically valuable. Think about that for a second. Technological progress accidentally made exploitation more profitable, and war became the first great factory supplying slaves to ancient states. At first, victorious armies often killed their enemies to prevent them from returning for revenge. Then someone recognized a horrifying but profitable alternative. Why kill prisoners when you could force them to work? From that point on, people who survived defeat in war increasingly became some of history's first true slaves. And this is where history begins leaving behind clearer evidence. In ancient Mesopotamia, one word used for a slave meant something close to a person from the mountains. People living on the plains often raided distant highland communities and carried captives home. In the eyes of the victors, these prisoners were no longer people with families, homes, and histories. They had become property, something that could be bought, sold, or exchanged. Some of the world's earliest clay tablets even record slaves being purchased with silver. But wait, enslaved people were not always foreigners captured in war. Sometimes they were your own neighbors. A poor person who could not repay a debt might be forced to surrender their labor or even themselves to a creditor. During famines, some parents were driven to sell their children into wealthy households in exchange for food. It sounds like a nightmare, except that for many families, it was a desperate survival strategy. Debt slaves sometimes received less brutal treatment than foreign prisoners because they shared the same language and culture as their owners. But they still had no control over their own lives. So how could people tell who was enslaved? Sometimes the answer was written directly onto the body. An owner might tattoo a name or symbol onto a slave's hand or forehead as a mark of possession. In Mesopotamia, enslaved people could also be required to wear a distinctive hairstyle known as the abadu. Those who ran away or resisted orders could face severe punishment, including the loss of an ear. A small mark on the body could determine the course of an entire life. Now let's turn to ancient Egypt, who really built the pyramids. The familiar image shows thousands of slaves dragging stones beneath cracking whips. But here's where it gets interesting. Most pyramid workers were probably free farmers performing compulsory labor for the king. During the annual flood, when their fields could not be cultivated, they worked on royal projects as a form of taxation. That does not mean slavery was absent from Egypt. Enslaved people still served in private homes and palaces, while others were sent into harsh and dangerous mines. In Shang Dynasty China, the story becomes even darker. Enslaved people were not only forced to work, they could also be used in ritual sacrifices. When a king or noble died, groups of people might be buried with him so they could continue serving him in the afterlife. They were treated almost like grave goods placed beside chariots, weapons, and other possessions. It sounds like something from a horror legend, but archaeological burial pits show that it really happened. But here is a strange paradox. The more enslaved labor a society possessed, the less pressure it sometimes felt to invent labor-saving machines. When thousands of people could be forced to work by hand, owners had little reason to make the work faster or easier. Enslaved workers gained nothing from finishing sooner, so they might work slowly or deliberately damage their tools. In response, owners often gave them heavy, crude equipment that was difficult to break. A system that appeared efficient could actually hold technological progress back. Still, enslavement did not always last forever. In Mesopotamia, some enslaved people could save enough money to purchase their freedom. Those who were skilled, intelligent, or highly trusted might rise to become household managers, scribes, or advisors. In certain cases, the children of a union between an enslaved person and a free person could also be recognized as free. The path out was painfully narrow, but it was not always completely closed. So why did ancient slavery eventually begin to weaken? It was not simply because people suddenly became kinder. When empires stopped expanding, the supply of cheap prisoners captured in war began to shrink. Buying, feeding, supervising, and guarding enslaved workers became increasingly expensive. Some landowners discovered that allowing farmers to work their own land and then taxing them could be more profitable. History sometimes moves forward because morality changes. But quite often, the wallet gets there first. Even so, slavery left a deep scar on human history. The wealth of one group was often built by taking away the freedom and future of another. Understanding that past is not about encouraging resentment. It is about recognizing how precious modern ideas of equality truly are. Freedom can feel ordinary until we remember that millions of people once lived without even the right to belong to themselves. And there is one major misconception we need to clear up. Ancient slavery was not permanently tied to skin color. In Greece and Rome, almost anyone could become enslaved after losing a war, falling into debt, or being kidnapped. Some enslaved people were physicians, teachers, and highly educated scholars. A person could be brilliant and still be treated by the law as an object. The close association between slavery and a particular race developed much more clearly in far later periods of history. But the story did not end in the fields. As the first cities began to rise, the demand for labor exploded. Canals had to be dug, levees raised, and defensive walls built. There were no engines, cranes, or trucks. The only available fuel was human muscle. And behind the grandeur of many early civilizations, a darker pattern emerged. The more they built, the more forced labor they needed. Not every enslaved person, however, spent their days hauling stone or digging ditches. In Rome, educated slaves could teach children, write letters, practice medicine, or manage enormous sums of money. Some wore fine clothing, ate well, and lived in villas that poor free citizens could only envy. It sounds comfortable until you remember one thing. They were still property. Their owner could sell them or send them away at any moment. A golden cage is still a cage. That is why so many enslaved people were willing to risk everything to escape. They crossed forests, climbed mountains, and tried to stay ahead of armed search parties. Why take such a terrifying chance? Because good food and a warm bed could never make up for being treated like an object. The desire for freedom was stronger than fear. Constant escapes and rebellions forced ancient societies to tighten security, create new laws, and impose even harsher punishments. But here is where the story becomes especially unsettling. Not everyone entered slavery through war. During famine, a person might sell themselves simply to avoid starvation. A wealthy household would provide food and shelter in exchange for years of service, sometimes for life. It was called a choice, but when the only alternative was death by hunger, the word voluntary carried a bitter meaning. As the enslaved population grew, markets for buying and selling people appeared. Buyers examined teeth, muscles, health, and practical skills as if they were inspecting livestock. Craftspeople, literate workers, and those with specialized knowledge usually commanded higher prices. Clay tablets and sales receipts from roughly 4,000 years ago still survive. The disturbing part is how an entire human life could be reduced to a few lines of writing and a number measured in silver. Geography also quietly determined where slavery could flourish. On wide, open plains, escapees were easier to spot, and landowners could control vast agricultural estates. In rugged mountains, however, a person could disappear into a forest or vanish beyond a rocky pass. Slavery was therefore harder to maintain in places where the landscape offered too many hiding places. Sometimes, a mountain range protected freedom more effectively than any law. During raids, women and children were often among the first to be taken. Adult men could be seen as too dangerous or too likely to rebel, while women and children were considered easier to control and absorb into a new community. Many children were born into slavery without ever committing a crime or losing a battle. Still, some ancient legal systems allowed the children of enslaved women and free men to gain freedom under certain conditions. From there, an enormous divide opened inside society. On one side were people who could own land, wealth, and even other human beings. On the other were those who did not even control their own lives. The division between owner and owned made extreme inequality seem normal to generations of people. And that was only part of the story, because these ideas continued shaping laws and human rights for thousands of years. Enslaved people attached to temples sometimes occupied a different position. They were not considered the property of a private individual, but servants of the gods. Some poor people even entered temple service voluntarily in search of food, shelter, and protection from officials or creditors. Their lives were still not fully free, but they were often more stable and less dangerous than life in the mines. When every option is terrible, people tend to choose the cage that hurts the least. So why did this system eventually weaken? Growing concern for human dignity mattered, but the owner's finances played a major role too. Enslaved workers had to be fed, guarded, supervised, and forced to work, while free laborers had stronger reasons to work efficiently and find better methods. Once the cost of control exceeded the profit it produced, coercion no longer looked like the smartest economic choice. History has a strange habit. Sometimes morality wins only after the economy decides that cruelty has become too expensive. And here is perhaps the hardest part to believe. There was a time when even some of the world's greatest minds considered slavery completely normal. Certain Greek philosophers argued that some people were born with a slave nature and needed others to rule over them. That sounds absurd today, but when an entire society accepts an idea for generations, even brilliant people can struggle to see what is wrong with it. Intelligence may help us understand the world, but it does not automatically make us fair. Slavery did not always begin with war or unpaid debt. In some communities, members of the group could lose their freedom after committing a serious crime. Before prisons existed, forcing an offender to serve the community could be seen as an alternative to execution. That person became a living warning to everyone else. It may sound practical at first until the power to punish falls into the hands of someone willing to abuse it. But wait, were slaves and servants really the same thing? A servant could earn wages, end the agreement, and leave an employer. An enslaved person could not. They could be sold, given away, exchanged, or passed down to an heir like land, furniture, or livestock. The real difference was not the kind of work they performed. It was whether they had the right to say no. One simple word could mark the distance between a free human being and a piece of property. Look at the ancient roads, canals, and enormous cities built from stone. We usually see the greatness of kings, rulers, and architects. But behind many of those projects stood countless workers who had no choice in what they did. Not every ancient wonder was built by slaves, but forced labor certainly helped create many large public works. History has a habit of remembering the person who gave the order while forgetting the people who lifted every stone. And when someone was enslaved, the first thing taken from them was not always their property. Sometimes it was their name. An owner might give a captive a new name that was easier to pronounce or better suited to the household. But the old name carried a family, a homeland, and a lifetime of memories. Erasing it was a way of cutting someone off from their own past. That is why, after gaining freedom, many people tried to recover their original names and origins, as though they were gathering the scattered pieces of themselves. Slavery also created trade routes stretching across deserts, rivers, and seas. People were carried thousands of miles from home and sold in places where they could not understand the language. Those same routes also transported goods, knowledge, and culture between civilizations. But here is the bitter contradiction. Some of the earliest connections between distant societies were built by turning human beings into merchandise. Development has never automatically meant moral progress. Some enslaved people were even placed in armies and forced to fight for the very rulers who owned them. Kings trained them as elite soldiers to protect palaces, defend the throne, and crush enemies. In return, loyalty and success in battle could sometimes bring freedom, wealth, or rank. It was one possible path out of slavery, but a deeply cruel one. To win back control of their lives, they first had to risk losing them on the battlefield. So why should we still study a painful story that began thousands of years ago? Because history is more than a list of kings, wars, and dates that are difficult to remember. It is a warning about what can happen when a society stops seeing a group of people as fully human. Knowledge helps us recognize the arguments once used to justify oppression. And once we recognize them, we have a better chance of stopping them when they return under a different name. Today, slavery is officially prohibited by law across the world. But exploitation does not disappear simply because we change the words used to describe it. Forced labor, child labor, and human trafficking can still survive in the shadows. Modern chains are not always made of iron. Sometimes they take the form of debt, threats, deception, or isolation. Protecting freedom is not a task humanity has already completed. It is a responsibility each generation must continue. Now return to the situation we imagined at the beginning. A job with no pay, no contract, and no right to leave. What makes it terrifying is not only the exhausting work. It is the fact that someone else has taken control of your life. Humanity has traveled a long way from prisoners treated as property to declarations affirming universal human rights. But real strength does not come from ruling over others. It comes from building a world where no one needs permission to belong to themselves.